Hello and welcome to this IOSH webinar. So this is Ruth Wilkinson on behalf of the Institution of Occupational Safety and Health, and the chartered health and safety body, charity, thought leader and international NGO. And I say good morning, good evening to all of you, wherever you are joining us for this session, whether it be live with us at this moment or whether you're watching back on record. As mentioned, I am Ruth Wilkinson and I'm the head of policy at IOSH, and I will be hosting this session with you today. And I've got an esteemed panel of speakers who will be with me to talk 10 years on from the tragedy of the Rana Plaza factory collapse back in April 2013, which resulted in the loss of 1,134 garment workers' lives and more than 2,500 workers being injured. Then also the knock-on effect of all those other families and the community from that disaster. This tragedy highlighted the poor working conditions, poor health and safety practices in Bangladesh garment industry, but not only that, also within global supply chains. And today we want to remember those who were impacted by this tragic event and look to see what progress or priorities that have happened since to improve those working conditions and also health and safety in global supply chains. So I am really pleased to announce that I'm joined on this session with colleagues. I've got a fantastic panel this morning, and I'll now ask each panelist to join me on the session by turning on their videos and introducing themselves. I will start with, as I can see, Miriam's come on the screen. I will ask Miriam just to do a brief introduction of yourself, please, Miriam, and then I'll move across to other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Miriam Neal. I'm a senior advisor at the International Accord on Health and Safety in the Textile and Garment Industry. I've worked with the Accord since 2014, when it was just starting as the Bangladesh Accord. Very pleased to be here today.
Oh, and it's fantastic to have you with us, Miriam. Thank you ever so much. I will now move across to Tuomo, who's sitting, waiting to also join us. Tuomo, if I could ask you to do an introduction for us, please.
So hello, my name is Tuomo Poutian, and I'm the head of the ILO here in Dhaka, Bangladesh.
Fantastic, thank you. And for all of you who are watching at the moment, we will also be joined very shortly by Peter McAllister, who's the Executive Director from the Ethical Trading Institute. So Peter's expected to join us very shortly, and when he does, I will make note of his arrival. But until then, before we get into the panel discussion that we've got planned, I would like to introduce a video from our previous IOSH Head of Policy and Public Affairs, Richard Jones. Richard Jones was in post at IOSH at the time of the disaster of Rana Plaza. So it's great for him to join us back here sort of 10 years on to provide his insights and an introduction to this session for us all. So if you could please play the video, I will leave Richard to do his presentation to start. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Jones, former Head of Policy at IOSH, and I'm very honoured to be invited back to mark this important 10-year anniversary of Rana Plaza. Today, I'll briefly outline IOSH's past work in this area and what I think the future focus should be. I think few of us will ever forget the distressing scenes on our TVs following the terrible Rana Plaza factory collapse. It caused over 1,100 deaths and lasting physical and psychological harm to many survivors. Having strongly argued that health and safety is vital for all organisations, IOSH was keen to ensure progress. We co-hosted high-level roundtables, took part in policy-building activity, and made a persuasive case for collaboration and well-managed work. A subsequent joint initiative known as the Bangladesh Accord, in which brands, factories, and worker representatives collaborated to improve workplace health and safety, was truly groundbreaking. It also served as a model for the new international accord, with Pakistan now introducing its own version, and hopefully other countries will follow suit. I think one key challenge is ensuring workers and managers have the core skills they need to work safely. So IOSH was pleased to co-fund 2 training initiatives, one for workers and community in Bangladesh, and another on fire safety in India, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. Looking at the scale of the challenge, we know ILO has estimated that the textile and garment sectors employ around 91 million workers globally. I think that while this offers much needed employment, we could also view it a bit like the proverbial iceberg, with many problems below the surface. It's a labour-intensive industry with complex and buyer-driven supply chains that can lack visibility, leading to the prevalence of modern slavery and forced labour. Sadly, exploitation can happen at all stages, from harvesting cotton to spinning yarn, and from dyeing fabric to making the products. It includes poor pay, long working hours, exposure to chemicals and fire safety, and gender-based violence. So organisations seeking to ensure decent work for everyone needs to monitor beyond their top-tier suppliers. This means tracing right through to their raw materials, working with factories to improve conditions, and engaging in socially responsible procurement. To help progress this, IOSH pushed for improved transparency and due diligence, and supported the UK's duty on supply chain transparency, also calling for it to be strengthened. And we've been pleased to help develop the free standard on modern slavery risk, BS 25700. Using this can help organisations of all types to manage their risks, as can the ILO Code of Practice for health and safety in the sector. So, for the future, let's ensure, a decade on from Rana Plaza, that we revitalise the push for decent work, with a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental right at every life cycle stage. We can all move the agenda forward: professionals, employers, workers, investors, and policymakers. I'd like to quickly highlight 6 priority areas, 3 for organisations and 3 for policymakers. From organisations, we need to see, firstly, more leadership and grassroots health and safety training. Secondly, more use of ILO guidance and relevant standards. And thirdly, more sign-ups to the legally binding health and safety accords. While from policymakers, we need to urge, firstly, that health and safety is integral to all trade and investment decisions. Secondly, that there's better regulation of factories, transparency, and labour rights. And thirdly, that there's progress on due diligence laws and the UN's decent work agenda. I'm delighted that IOSH is hosting this very timely and important webinar. Please get involved and support the goal of decent work for all and the IOSH Catch the Wave campaign. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Oh, my thanks there to Richard Jones, our former Head of Policy and Public Affairs at IOSH, for that insightful overview, the backgrounds, and also his thoughts on what needs to happen moving forward. So as we've just heard there are many actors who need to play a role in the progress that needs to be taken, including governments who can invest in occupational safety and health standards and in occupational safety and health conventions. This session is an excellent opportunity now to discuss the role of international standards and the recent recognition of a right to a safe and healthy working environment as one of the 5 fundamental principles and rights at work in the context of World Day for Safety and Health and Work in 2023, and also to remember those events that happened at Rana Plaza. I will now reintroduce the panel and ask them to put their videos back on and join me. We are still waiting on one of our panellists, Peter McAllister from the Ethical Trading Initiative. So if Peter does join us, I'll just welcome Peter, but otherwise Miriam and Tuomo will proceed with the question set that we have at hand here. And for everybody who's listening, we do have questions that we will all go through on the panel, but I would also like to invite all of you to put forward any questions that you have to panelists using the Q&A function at the bottom, so not the chat, using the Q&A, and we will get to your questions at the end. if for some reason we will run out of time during this session, we will do our best to try and respond to those outside of the session in writing where possible and as we can. So without further ado then, I will come to the first question, which I will pose to both Tuomo and Miriam in the first instance. Obviously, we know it's been a decade since Rana Plaza, but what improvements and key achievements have been made in Bangladesh? So if you don't mind, I'll come to you, Tuomo, first, please.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's fair to say that in the last 10 years, quite a lot and quite significant improvements have happened in the industry. And I think it's a testament to the investment that almost all parties in the global supply chain related to garment industry have really worked on and invested in. But I think there are maybe three things that I would like to mention here. One of them is that it is important that the governance and good governance in relation to occupational safety and health and labor rights in general continues to be attended to, right? And so that's very much what the ILO is focused on here in Bangladesh. It is to make sure that there are better laws and that these laws are understood, but also that they are backed up with the kind of government organizations and enforcement capacity that allows for safety and worker rights to be upheld. At the same time, it's also so that many of the changes that we see in occupational safety and health and labor rights maybe would not have been there if it wasn't for the quite a big push that the private sector and the multi-stakeholder organizations have been working on in the better part of this last 10 years. So that dual approach where the governance is built, but also the investment from the private sector and through these multi-stakeholder organizations has been really a key to progressively build a better understanding in terms of safety and health, occupational safety and health, industrial safety, and labor rights. And lastly, there is no way that one can maintain occupational safety and health or labor rights without the workers' voice and role. So if that space is not there, if there is not an enabling environment for freedom of association or for trade union rights or for workers at any level to be able to voice out their concerns, understand their roles and responsibilities, and to work on safety and health, then it all falls short, right? So these are really the three areas where I would like to start the discussion from.
Oh, fantastic. And great three areas, and acknowledging the role of all those actors there, Tuomo. Thank you. Miriam, I'd like to come to you, please, with the same question.
Thank you, Ruth. So picking up on one point there that Tuomo raised about the private sector, I can speak to the great achievement that was the coming together of brands, retailers, and trade unions, with also a strong role for worker rights NGOs as witness signatories in the signing of the Bangladesh Accord, which happened 3 weeks after the Rana Plaza collapse. I think that was a huge acknowledgement by the private sector, by the brands and retailers in the clothing industry, that the social audit model that they'd been following for decades prior to Rana Plaza had failed effectively to secure the right to life, the right to safe working conditions in their supply chain. And it's great regret of everybody in this industry that it took a tragedy like Rana Plaza to bring about a model like the Accord. I think it's worth noting the model of the Accord, which is a legally binding agreement between global and Bangladeshi trade unions and clothing brands and retailers, with very strong transparency provisions and strong accountability provisions to ensure safe workplaces. That model had actually already been proposed by civil society and trade unions who were well aware of the high safety risks in the industry before Rana Plaza occurred. And like I said, it sadly took the Rana Plaza tragedy to make it a reality. But 3 weeks after Rana Plaza, the Accord was signed by key brands and retailers in the sector. And over the months that followed, over 220 brands and retailers from around the world signed on. And that in itself was a huge achievement. And I will share my screen if I can, just to show a few of the sort of results of that in terms of the scale of the programs under the Bangladesh Accord. The brands that have signed on in the first Accord and continue into the International Accord today. What I wanted to highlight is the number of factories that have been involved in the Accords program since it started. So over 2,400 factories in Bangladesh have had in-depth inspections for structural, fire and electrical safety since 2013. Of those, almost 500 factories have completed all of the safety issues that were identified in those first inspections, and the images there show safe egress routes out of factories. That was a big area of work to make fire separated and adequate egress routes in case of fire or other emergency. Over 2 million factory workers have been involved in Accord safety training sessions, so 3 sessions in each factory, which raises awareness around workers' safety rights and key risks which they can be aware of, and also crucially the right to refuse unsafe work, which, as many of you will know, in the Rana Plaza building the day before it collapsed, some of the occupants already evacuated, having seen cracks in the structure. Workers tried to raise these concerns, the workers in the factory buildings on the upper floors, and were told, unofficially were told, to go to work, otherwise they would miss their month's pay. So the right to refuse unsafe work without fear of reprisal is crucial, as we all understand now. So that features in the safety training sessions done at each factory. There is a complaints mechanism for raising any kind of safety or health and safety concerns. And to date, 6,000 or more issues have been raised and are processed by the Accord, or were processed by the Accord, now by the RMG Sustainability Council that implements Accord programs in Bangladesh. And this is a growing and very important part of our work. Links with what Tuomo was saying about the importance of workers being able to voice their concerns around safety and do that without any fear of reprisal. I also want to mention the safety committee training that the Accord introduced and still runs. So over 1,200 safety committees have completed that training. There are 8 modules which are run over several months in each factory. And then the safety committees have access to ongoing support to do their work. And these are joint worker and management safety committees that are especially trained to identify hazards on an ongoing basis, and then also trained in workplace dialogue, how to resolve these jointly between the workforce and the management teams. The last set of pictures there show a structural, in the top right, a structural weakness in a building that was identified by workers back in 2017. And I just give it as an example of how the right to refuse unsafe work is so fundamental and how it's protected under the Accord model. The workers in this factory fortunately were unionized, and the trade union raised this as a concern to the management and to the Accord engineers, that they were really concerned about the structural safety of a building. The Accord structural engineers immediately investigated and found that due to excavation works occurring in the neighbouring site to this factory, the structural integrity of the factory building had been adversely affected, and advised an immediate evacuation of the building until the site was made safe and the structure was reinforced and made safe again. And that was done through collaboration with the government authorities as well, and with the factory management and the trade union and the workforce being kept informed the whole time, so that they only re-entered when everybody was agreed that it was a safe workplace. So that just gives brings to life really the importance of these mechanisms. I would like to highlight a few more sort of detailed points around the kind of safety improvements that have been going on in factories in Bangladesh in the last 10 years, which I think the whole industry can take great pride in. So from a fire and building safety perspective, what we see across the Accord covered factories, which at the moment we have 1,600 factories that we're monitoring at the moment. They have made progress in all of their safety issues at 91%. We might not have verified all of those issues yet, but they're reported as most of those have been verified and the rest have been reported as fixed. In total, out of all of the factories, so we don't cover all the factories at any one time, given the sourcing relationships shift, but in total, 140,000 safety issues have been corrected out of 170,000 that have been identified over the last 10 years. To bring that to life a bit more, the kind of structural safety improvements that have been made where there was severe risk of structural concern, then there was temporary evacuation of those buildings until further detailed engineering assessments could be done, and where necessary, retrofitting could take place. The majority of factories, even if there wasn't critical concern, they still needed to do detailed engineering assessments to check structural safety, check the load and the adequacy of the strength of the concrete and columns. And in many cases, retrofitting was needed to strengthen those structures. And ongoing, there's been a lot of work by factories to develop load management plans so that the buildings are only loaded to the level that they are designed for. On fire safety, there's been a huge need and a huge amount of investment to ensure safe egress in case of fire or other emergency. So we see fire separated exit routes, clear of obstructions like storage was a common obstruction, and no lockable gates. So the vast majority of factories had lockable gates, and these have been removed. There is a lot of work still going on. It's been completed in like I said, 500 factories, but it's still underway in other factories to ensure that they have reliable, adequate, comprehensive fire alarm and detection systems across their whole building. And the same with fire suppression systems. So this is work which in some cases is taking many years to complete successfully. And on electrical safety, we now see, and there was a lot of work in the early days on this, and it moved quite rapidly to ensure that the electrical layout was properly planned and designed with adequate records, and that throughout the factory, the electrical cabling was properly installed with adequate earthing and so on. And then day-to-day factories are putting more emphasis on the cleaning of dust and lint, which is a big risk of fire around the electrical systems. So it's the most common cause of fire in these factories. So that's just to give you an idea of the level of monitoring that has gone on in the last 10 years and the amount of progress that has been made. And also you can see from the numbers, there's still work to be done. And these are minimum life safety requirements to have in the factories. So the work is still ongoing. The last point I'd like to make, if I may, is around the progress that's been made in the worker complaints mechanism. I mentioned already over 6,000 worker complaints have been raised with the Accord and the RSC in the last 10 years. Around 40% of those relate with safety concerns, whether it's fire and building safety, or the majority relate to occupational safety and health. I just list here the most common issues just to raise people's awareness. Unsafe drinking water, excessive heat, denial of maternity pay or leave, workplace violence or threats of, sexual harassment, forced overtime or excessive overtime, and COVID-19 related issues since 2020, of course, which cover a wide range, but apart from the kind of obvious around risk to health and hygiene, wage and employment contract issues also come up in relation to COVID-19, much less so now, but certainly at the peak of the pandemic. So I will pause there and happy to see that Peter has joined. Hi.
Lovely. Thank you, Miriam. That was really useful information, and I've had questions coming through, but I will come to those later on for everybody who's listening. And Peter, yeah, thank you ever so much for joining us. As I sort of mentioned earlier, Peter McAllister, Executive Director from the Ethical Trading Initiative. We're on question 1, Peter, where Tuomo and both Miriam have just gone through this question, which I'd like to come to you, if that's okay. It's been a decade since Rana Plaza. What improvements and key achievements have been made in Bangladesh? So as we've just heard from Tuomo and Miriam's perspective, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on this one as well. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Ruth. And sorry I'm late. Technical problems this morning. It's always a Monday thing. So apologies for that. I'm just listening to what Miriam said. She's obviously covered a lot of the ground, and I'm sure Tuomo would have covered it. So maybe not let me repeat things so much, but maybe offer insights from where we sit as an organisation that brings together trade unions, NGOs, and international brands, many of whom source from Bangladesh. And I think the things that we see, in addition to the sort of structural and practical things, are a change of attitudes, both in terms of suppliers in Bangladesh and the leadership from people like the BGMEA, which has really changed dramatically over this 10 years. Understandably, when the tragedy happened, people were very much on the back foot. I think everybody was shocked. I don't think I remember speaking to anybody from a supplier or locally or internationally who wasn't just shocked by the images and the scale of the disaster. But there was also a lot of resistance about, what's it to do with me? How do we get involved? What should we do? And I think that in addition to the practical work that the Accord has done, it's also demonstrated that you can get effective collaboration across, at some point it was 200 brands, if I remember rightly, on issues which are very tricky, which go to the heart of business, which have a cost, but have demonstrated that you can tackle very difficult issues on a collaborative basis in a way that would not have been possible on an individual brand basis, and goes way beyond the sort of typical compliance. That's also good to see that that's now translating to other countries. So it's not something that's sort of come and gone. I would argue that there are many other issues, and Miriam, you just pointed a few, which also require effective collaboration across the sector. But I think that's important to point to, that's a positive. I would also say, and again, there are experts on this call, the health and safety isn't just about wiring and buildings and fire escapes. It's also about attitudes and culture, and that's changed dramatically in Bangladesh. Again, at the time, if you talk to people, possibly understandably, there was a level of defensiveness. They felt their industry was being attacked. It's chalk and cheese now. If you talk to suppliers now, they're proud about their factories. A lot of those factories have moved into purpose-built facilities on different sites. They talk about the greening. They're also talking, again, very proudly about exiting LDC status. So the whole attitude to wanting to talk about and engage on health and safety issues and a health and safety culture, I think, has changed. Again, let's not be naive. There's still more to do, and we mustn't pretend that everything's been achieved. And we mustn't forget this, it started from a tragedy. But I think those attitudes towards how this business can and should run and how partnerships should evolve, I think is important. Maybe the last thing that I think is still maybe a work in progress. The Accord at the time was negotiated internationally. There were reasons for that. There were complications and challenges about whether that should happen. And I think we've made a transition for much more national engagement and national ownership. And I think that's important as well. The role of brands and international institutions is really vital in this. But ultimately, if you're not able to really institutionalize and a culture and approach, and if you're not getting strong ownership from a country, in this case Bangladesh, but it could be other places, will only go so far. So that again, I think, is a very positive observation, how that's progressed now. In the early days, I think it was challenging, and a lot of work and a lot of conversations have been happening, but I think you see that change in attitude to nationalize and have national ownership over these initiatives is also an important area. So that would be my contribution really for this point.
Lovely, thank you, Peter. And I think we've had some great perspectives from all of you there, and obviously, Miriam, great to see some of the statistics. Peter just mentioned about it transitioning across into other countries. So Miriam, if you don't mind, I'd like to just come to you to say, what should we expect from the expansion of the international accord to Pakistan? If you could just talk us a little bit through that, that'd be really, really useful to understand.
Yeah, of course. So the decision was made by the international accord signatories. So that's the companies and the trade unions in the accord, to expand and set up a program in Pakistan starting in January 2023. And what you can expect from the approach is a similar set of programs, so still safety inspections and monitoring of remediation at all covered factories, training that I described earlier for safety committees and also all employee awareness raising sessions, and a worker complaints mechanism for safety issues. So similar set of programs, because I think all involved have acknowledged that you need all of those programs really to kind of complement one another. And the levels of risk in terms of safety issues in Pakistan are considered to be, there are some differences. For example, structure isn't considered as critical a risk, but the fire safety certainly. So that warrants kind of technical inspections. So that's where the similarities are, that there will be some key differences. So I'm happy Peter already mentioned this around the importance, and I think it's one of the lessons learned from the Bangladesh Accord, is the real importance of having more national ownership and involvement from the start. I mean, the Bangladesh Accord had a lot of engagement with the government from the start and also with the industry, but there wasn't an involvement in the governance. So in that sense, they're sort of more of an external stakeholder in a sense, whereas for the Pakistan Accord, it's written into the agreement that there will be a national governance body that will be set up from the start, and that will at a minimum include the industry associations to work alongside the brands and unions that are already Accord signatories. So we're in dialogue with industry representatives since the Pakistan Accord agreement was reached between our signatories, to try and understand what form that will take. So that's a key difference. The other thing we have we're changing is really the implementation approach. So we're going to take a phased implementation approach, working with smaller batches of factories and rolling it out over time. And anyone involved, anyone working in this arena 10 years ago will remember that there was a very, very high sense of urgency to get to every factory immediately or as quickly as possible. So the rollout of the Accord within, I remember we organised inspections at 1,000 factories in 6 months. And that was extremely intense to get the teams mobilised to do that, and then to do any kind of adequate follow-up. It was extremely intense and extremely challenging for everybody involved. And as a result, we weren't able to do the kind of close follow-up, which we years later have built into the programme as a way of ensuring that factories are really bought into the process and can really learn from the inspection findings and find the best solutions for their factory. That takes quite a lot of dialogue. So we're phasing the rollout of the programs in Pakistan to enable closer engagement with each factory that participates. Another key difference, something that I saw in Richard's video at the start around the need to go further down the supply chain. Bangladesh is largely a cut, make, trim industry, and fabrics imported generally. There's some integrated mills with garment production, but Pakistan is really a very big textile producer, where fabric is produced on site with the finished product. They will already be in scope from the start. but we have got a plan and intention to work with fabric mills further down the supply chain in the future. So we'll still start the way we did in Bangladesh, going to the end product production site, but we have got a strong wish to go further down the chain once we've understood the first tier. We don't know what that will look like. That's quite uncharted territory. It's quite difficult to anticipate that until we've done some quite extensive mapping and understanding of the relationship between fabric mills and the production sites for clothing and home textiles. But it's a good evolution. It's going in the right direction.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. And I was just thinking it's ever so important. We talk about the supply chains quite a lot. So hearing, that there's progress there, planning to go beyond the tier ones, the mapping. And I know it's something that our IOSH members, we've definitely talked about on different webinars, and we'll continue to promote good occupational safety and health in the supply chain. So thank you for bringing that into this dialogue. I'm going to come on to the second question that I've got, and do let me know if we've covered this. I was going to come to both yourself, Miriam, and Tuomo on this. It says that when we think about the improvements that we've outlined, and we've outlined a lot of improvements there, what would you say we have learned as we move forwards? I don't know if you want to come in first, Tuomo, on this.
Yeah, happy to, and thank you for Peter and Miriam sort of highlighting this quite a broad and impressive reforms that have happened already, in particular in Bangladesh, and how it's building forward to other countries. I think for me, what is really, really a big learning and important here is that it takes kind of like a holistic reform agenda to produce comprehensive results. So it cannot be just the building safety, it cannot be just the fire safety, it cannot be just labor rights. It has to be all of that together, right? And the learning and perhaps the internalization that it's possible in a country like Bangladesh to come together and to work dedicatedly, even if it was challenging, and even if there were a lot of hurdles and a lot of initial resistance, it actually is possible to come together and collectively produce the right kind of results. And while having said that, I think it's also important to remember that these results are not yet steady. You need to maintain occupational safety and health. You need to continue to pay attention to workers' rights, to the quality of the labor law, to the quality of the institutions, be they government institutions or private sector driven or multi-stakeholder institutions. They need to basically earn their keep and credibility every day, because safety needs to be managed every day, right? So that's really, it's that the foundation has been built, but it's really a collective labor reform that includes the governance aspects, the quality of the labor laws, even access to justice in terms of labor courts and redress and complaints mechanism. It all is part of a kind of like a modern way of doing business. And that's, I think, what ultimately and hopefully the Bangladesh experience will show. But that journey is still there to be had, right? And I think one point which was kind of like alluded to is that it's not just the garment industry. Countries like Bangladesh, they are growing very fast. They are diversifying, and there are multiple products, multiple workplaces that all need to take advantage of the learning and become safe. And that can only be collectively done, right? And one of the weakest links here in Bangladesh, it's really the SMEs and the informal economy, right? The informal sector workplaces. So if there are accidents that are noticeable, oftentimes they are in these facilities that sort of fall short of the kind of regulations and capacities that are needed. And that's kind of like what we would like to see happen is that the export industries and the garment industry learning is increasingly democratized and made available for SMEs and also for the smaller suppliers.
Obviously some powerful food for thought there, Tuomo, particularly around that holistic and collective approach and beyond the garment industry. And Thank you. And Miriam, just from your perspective, is there anything you'd like to add to that question, please?
Yeah, I was just reflecting what Toroma was saying about the learning needing to be democratized. And I feel like that is a really good, that's a good forward-looking message. And just having a bit of a backward-looking moment, I feel like there's been a huge amount of learning, even in the formalized export sector, around safety. I think when we first started talking with brands and their suppliers about the inspection findings, there was so little understanding of why certain things pose safety risks. And I feel like now that's normalized in the export sector and in the brands and retailers understanding, you know, they're at the end of the supply chain. There's now you know, people speak the language of safety in a way that they didn't when we started this work 10 years ago. So it's come a really long way in terms of people's understanding of safety, and non-technical people, like I'm not an IOSH expert, I'm not an engineer, but I now can understand what the engineers tell us when they go to a factory and they find certain issues. So I think that's been a really big sort of collective learning across the supply chain, and just really specifically, you know, making existing buildings that have structural integrity issues, retrofitting them to be code compliant was a huge task across Bangladesh. And I remember at the time, you know, the chief safety officer at the time at the beginning said, there is no blueprint to follow here. No one's done this before across a big scale of a manufacturing sector to retrofit and make them structurally safe. So now there's a huge amount of understanding in the engineering community in Bangladesh and internationally about what that process involves. So I think that is something to applaud, really, like that the engineering community and the factories have worked together to do this extensive retrofitting to make those factories safe. But I agree with Tuomo that it is a little bit the tip of the iceberg in terms of we're working with the export sector and a subset of the export sector, because we don't cover all exporters through the Accord. At least I know a lot is done through the government's increasing capacity. But I would still say it's worth reflecting on just how much has been learned in that regard. Yeah, I'll leave it there and let Peter come in.
Yeah, again, some great reflections. Thanks, Miriam. Peter, anything for you to add to the question 2 there?
Not really to add to what's been said. I guess really just picking up on Tuomo's point, I think, can we draw wider lessons learned that in tackling health and safety and fire safety and building safety, can we bring a similar collaborative approach to tackle some of the other issues that bedevil the sector? I mean, we still see low wages and we still see, you know, very, very low real wage growth, and we know that bedevils the sector. I know we're talking about Rana Plaza, but there were lessons learned through the COVID pandemic about how actually interconnected everybody is along the value chain, yet typically the relationship is still defined by the next order. So there are some big questions around how this sector works that requires that same sort of courage, bravery, focus and engagement to move this industry not only to a place where the buildings are safe, which is of course vital, but actually we can start to talk about the benefits that the industry brings rather than always having to talk about the problems that are related to it. So I think there are some wider issues, wider lessons to be learned, and still, you know, challenges that remain, not just for Bangladesh, but for the sector wherever it is.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And I suppose sort of following on a little bit from that, coming to my next question, if I can come to you, please, Peter. It says, given what we've learned and the steps we've been taking in recent years, do you see any aspects that might be considered an obstruction of this forward thinking? Are there any challenges that would see us taking a step back? And I suppose you mentioned opportunities as well. I'll sort of throw in for any of those opportunities going forward. So yeah, so pose that question your way, please, Peter.
Thank you. I mean, I'm an optimist, so I generally like to think of the positive things, but there are things that worry me at the moment. Partly we are in a global economic environment where there are significant pressures at both ends of just about every supply chain, whether it's garments or food. You've got, you know, increased energy prices, you've got increased food prices. So at one end, workers' wages go less far, and yet they're not seeing any wage growth. And at the other end, you've got consumer pressure. So people are trying to offer lower prices, better value, and so forth. So you've got a lot of pressure through value chains, which exacerbate the typical lack of power balances and the market inadequacies. So they don't, so that they make things worse. The risk is, therefore, you cut corners on non-essentials. Well, do you need to do that health and safety inspection, or do you need to engage with workers in the same way? So that's a bigger picture risk that I think we see across all sectors and pretty much all markets as well, that we need to think about. But I guess there's another one which is sort of baked into the industry as well, which is it typically still approaches everything through a audit and compliance approach. And that is useful for certain things, but it doesn't necessarily lean into some of the big structural issues that the sector faces, which is why the Accord wasn't a traditional compliance initiative. It was a much bigger, much braver, much bolder, much more demanding initiative. And I think the risk is, if we slip back into well, the audit doesn't tell us there's a problem and we're compliant, we're not going to face into some of the things that Tuomo was talking about, or how do you get social protection across an industry, or some of the other bigger issues that the sector, like other sectors face. So it doesn't mean that's easy. It doesn't mean it's easy for individual businesses, whether they're, you know, facing consumers and facing competition on a high street, or if they're a supplier end, then they're just making sure they've got the next orders. But what we do know is that effective collaboration can drive success, and we know we've still got some big systemic issues to face into. So we sort of got to work harder, I guess, to make sure they stay top of mind.
Yeah, some great reflections. Thank you, Peter. And I suppose following on and building from that, I'm going to come across to Omo next to say, we know there are still significant areas of weaknesses. How can the International Labour Organization, the adoption of a safe and healthy working environment as a fundamental principle and right at work, be put in practice to drive these improvements that we need? So yeah, it'd be great to hear from you on this one, Tuomo.
Well, thank you. And of course, the fact that the occupational safety and health now is a fundamental principle and right in work sort of adds to the volumes of the other fundamental rights. So it kind of like allows for dedicated attention to be built also in terms of legislation, in terms of capacities, in terms of attention in line with the kind of foundations that we collectively have set that are there now in Bangladesh, for example, in relation to occupational safety and health. So it allows for that kind of, if not a compulsion, but at least it allows for the occupational safety and health legislation and practices to be taken seriously, also in terms of the government. And from there it follows that the employers and workers and hopefully the public at large will sort of benefit, right, from that kind of a better governance and better legislation. It's also one thing that I think is important is that it also to codify and to kind of like put in place systems to manage occupational safety and health, right? So what has been sort of been built for a while is kind of like a network and communities of practice and professionalization of the art of occupational safety and health, right? So 10 years ago, there was none of that, right? There were no safety managers, there was no competence. There was no even sort of how to know if we are doing the right kind of things in terms of industrial safety or fire safety. So that's something that has quite tremendously changed. And there is an increasing emergence of this body of knowledge, but also substantiated by training and capacity building, right? And so that's something that needs to continue to be built. But that certainly there is much more that kind of capacity and awareness. And I think that plays very well for garments industry, but also other industries of Bangladesh, because there's a lot of issues around chemical safety, maintenance, storage, logistics, you name it, right? So it's very important that there is that kind of codification and that kind of competency building in relation to occupational safety and health and industrial safety.
Yeah, thanks, Tuomo. And I'm just thinking this will move me nicely to the next question I'd like to pose to Miriam. So we are talking about So the breadth of those occupational safety and health factors, and Tuomo just mentioned, you know, the chemical aspects and, you know, the capacity building, need for retention. But Miriam, I'm thinking, when we consider the issues arising around safety and health in practice, where do you consider our understanding has moved? And how is the transition from fire and building safety to occupational safety and health being? So we know from your slides, it's very much in that arena, and it'd be great just to talk about that movement to general occupational safety and health, and if you foresee any improvements on those existing arrangements to addressing human rights due diligence across global supply chains. Sorry, it's a bit long-winded there, Miriam. I can break it down as needed.
No, it's okay. I'll break it down. I'll deal with the first part first around occupational safety and health. I already described how the Accord focused initially on inspections and monitoring remediation around fire and building safety. That actually got extended after a few years into boiler safety as well, because boilers were identified as a key safety risk. And I think that's also that's an example of why having the worker representatives involved in the governance of the Accord has been so fundamental. The Labour caucus advocated and were able to get agreement from the brand side to invest in also running a boiler safety inspection program. So it's just an example of how standards evolve over time, and they evolve more rapidly and more effectively if workers are involved and have a voice in, more than a voice, have actual authority in the governance of the organisation. But once the training and complaints programs were started a couple of years into the programs, that's when occupational safety and health could start to take on a life of its own in a way. So the safety committees are trained broadly on occupational safety and health, and then over time play an increasing role in the factory of how they monitor hazards and risks ongoing. And the complaints mechanism, I already listed some of the sort of typical issues that have come out of the complaints mechanism. I think we're still at quite an early stage of understanding really systemically what the occupational safety and health risks are in the clothing sector. And there is a sense that the complaints mechanism is getting increasing use by workers. It really got it was really drawn on heavily during the pandemic, and since then it's sort of become very well known and very well trusted, so it's increasingly used. And the team has in the RMG Sustainability Council has all on just to stay on top of each individual complaint and ensure that they can investigate in a timely manner. Time is very critical, and ensure remedy where remedy is due. What they haven't had time to do, and what I know the head of that department is keen to do, is take a step back and analyse what is this telling us about systemic issues for occupational safety and health in the sector, and what kind of more strategic interventions might be needed from the industry, and also perhaps also from the brands. So in some areas you can tell there will be some drivers of risk which come from the buying side. So the obvious example is always around forced overtime or excessive overtime, and that is by and large driven by order volumes and lead times. So that, you know, we haven't done that work yet, and I think it's something which is needed, is a kind of broader analysis of what workers are telling us individually, but as a whole, about what's happening, what kind of things are affecting their safety and health day to day. If I could just speak quickly to the human rights due diligence legislation, that's been a sort of new development really in the last sort of, let me think, 5 years, and growing across the world. And growing, sort of evolving in terms of substance, from reporting requirements to more substantive requirements and responsibilities for companies to identify and mitigate human rights risks in their supply chains. I mean, just very simply, it's really compatible with the approaches we're talking about, because a collective, transparent, accountable approach like the Accord and like other initiatives that have started since, for example, ACT on living wages, these approaches are really compatible with human rights due diligence requirements on companies. So I think they're really mutually supportive. So it's a trend which we're obviously very happy to see. And it also influences our programs. So it gives us more, it kind of challenges us more to think, okay, it is really important to go further down the chain, for example, because that's a key principle in human rights due diligence, that you take a risk-based approach rather than a relational one. So you don't just deal with your immediate suppliers, but you scan to understand risks wherever they are and then make interventions to mitigate those risks. So in that sense, it challenges us to think more ambitiously. When I say us, I mean our signatories, the companies and the trade unions. And also in terms of scope, there's some discussions amongst the signatories about whether the complaints mechanism should be opened up to deal with issues that go beyond safety and health, because it's recognized as a very effective complaints mechanism. It's independent, it's accessible to many, many workers, and it's trusted by and large. So that's very difficult for individual companies to achieve on their own. So yeah, it also challenges us to think, can we go beyond safety and health in some areas of our work in a way that would help fulfill the human rights due diligence requirements?
Lovely, thank you, Miriam. And I'm thinking of jumping to a question on workers' voice and bringing Peter in here, as we've talked about the complaints programme you've just mentioned and the process, how it's being used. And I'm just interested, Peter, if I can come to you first on your thoughts on how workers' voices can be amplified to better understand their perception of their workplaces and working conditions. So I'll come to Peter first, but then I will open to Omo and Miriam to come in on this as well, please.
Yeah, I'm struggling a bit, Ruth, with the term worker voice, which I know is sort of common currency at the moment. And I think, Miriam, you were talking to this. It's got to be more than voice. It's got to be about agency. So first thing, of course, we want people to be able to speak up and share their opinion. But if they're not actually confident and not supported, then to be able to put that opinion forward or bargain collectively, then voice only takes us so far. So yes, there are good mechanisms out there, and I think we are getting better at hearing worker voice. But what we know is when you have an active trade union working in collaboration with management, then it's not just an individual's worker voice, but actually you've got agency in terms of addressing issues. We've seen that through our own work by promoting social dialogue in factories and breaking down some of the myths about what workers may or may not want once they've got a chance to speak to management, and management actually learning that workers, unsurprisingly possibly, have a lot of insights about what goes on in a factory and what could make it better and resolving issues. So I think we do need to challenge ourselves to say voice potentially is passive and individual, and actually we're talking about agency here, where workers have a stake in a factory being run well. They have a stake in it being green. They have a stake in it being successful. They have a stake in resolving problems. And whether that's at a sector and a governance level, which I think you see at the Accord, is possible, but it's still not very common and not very frequent in factories around the globe, that there are still very few that actually welcome and engage with trade unions as a constructive partner. So there are mechanisms, there are ways this is tried and trusted. It's not easy. There is still a lot of fear and misunderstanding between different parties. And of course, there are difficult disputes at times. That happens, wherever you are in the world. That's not limited to this sector or to Bangladesh. But we're convinced, and when we see this, when you get good engagement by management with workers who feel confident, workers who don't feel they're going to be picked on or dismissed, what have you, and workers who have the skills and the confidence and preferably the backing of a trade union, that actually works for everybody. So still not enough, as I say, not frequent enough. We've seen better initiatives at the sector level, country level, national level, but still I would say a big need for people to, again, be brave, courageous, and see that this is something that can help not only with day-to-day things. It can also help up the value chain in terms of a due diligence mechanism. If you've got trade unions active in a factory, look, guess what? They're looking out for child labour, looking out for forced labour, they're looking out for accidents, they're looking out for a whole range of day-to-day things that often don't get reported because they're individual, but if you add them all up, are quite a significant challenge across the industry. So voice yes, agency is a preference in my opinion.
Yeah, like that. So voice was mentioned to agency, and obviously the importance of the social dialogue there. I'm just thinking, Tuomo, is there anything you'd like to add on to this one from your perspective, please?
Yeah, no, absolutely, of course. I mean, there is room to certainly improve in terms of workers' representation and having representative organizations of workers to be that agent, right? I mean, it is good to have voice, that's for sure, but it's even better if that is backed up by collective bargaining agreements and true environment for freedom of association. And I think there's a lot that in Bangladesh can be done in that area still. There are about 300 or so trade unions registered per year, not only in the garment sector. There's still certain challenges in terms of trade union registration. There's also the collective bargaining agreements cover only about 1.5% of workers. So it's a very, very low number. And trade unions cover only about 5% of all of workers, even a bit less. So there's quite a lot to be done in terms of continuing to build that agency, that sort of capacity of the trade unions to represent themselves through organizations of their own choosing. And of course, for ILO, that is a very, very important part of having social dialogue and industrial relations mechanisms that work, right? So it's not only what happens at the enterprise level, it's also about the quality of the lawmaking. It's also about having check and balances when it comes to negotiating wages and having that true capacity of the workers to be there where decisions and policies and laws are made, right? So that is certainly a very, very important area of continuing work and interest.
Fantastic, thank you. Miriam, anything to add further on this question, please?
No, just wholehearted agreement with what Peter and Tuomo have said, and I've already mentioned different examples throughout this session around the importance of unions' involvement in, at the sectorial level in initiatives like the Accord, but also I gave that example of how the unions were able to bring forward a complaint about structural safety, which potentially, we will never know, but potentially saved hundreds, if not thousands of lives. So I think it's just so important that there is continued awareness of the kind of obstructions that unions face and moves to remove those obstacles. And I guess one reflection would be, I think in the kind of brand and retailer segment of the supply chain, I've seen a sort of greater understanding from brands and retailer representatives about the value and importance of working with trade unions, because they've worked so closely over the last 10 years in various initiatives, but I just speak from the Accord's perspective, and seen that it's just essential to have the unions involved in running these programs. So I think that there is progress in that regard in just sort of from the commercial side of a recognition of the importance of that collaboration, but more to be done at a workplace level, certainly. But there's steps in the right direction. I'm aware of the ETI's work on that with social dialogue programs. So let's just hope that has a kind of ripple effect.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Miriam. Thanks to everybody for answering that one. I've got another question, sort of a last one of the questions we got prepared for Tuomo, and then I'll come to some of the Q&A box before we wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. So I'm just thinking, Tuomo, we did hear about some of those evolutions of standards of health and safety practice that Miriam mentioned. Have there been changes in accident protection systems, and what systems are in place for worker compensation and return to work, for example?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm quite glad to report that indeed there are some new initiatives going on. And generally, of course, in Bangladesh, there's a lot of focus on building workplace social protection systems. And that is something that is generated also through the realization after COVID and during COVID that it is a must to have some unemployment and healthcare and health insurance and also accident insurance systems. And it is really the accident insurance system, which we call employment injury scheme, that has been rolled out. And this is really directly sort of referenceable to Rana Plaza and what was done after Rana Plaza. There was a Rana Plaza trust fund that dispensed over $30 billion worth of compensation to those who were affected. But that was kind of like a one-time, one-issue kind of investment. So now what we have been able to, as ILO, sort of guide through with the government and the employers and workers here, and also supported by many of the brands, is to really to start and roll out a longer-term employment injury system that is based on the ILO's sort of convention on employment injury, and is kind of like based on loss of earnings. So not just a one-time payment that was still the case even during the Rana Plaza, but kind of like, yes, you get a compensation immediately, but you also get a monthly compensation based on the loss of earnings principle, and also based on assessment of the actual injury, right? So that's quite exciting. It's if successful, will generate a modern employment injury system for Bangladesh. It's also predicated on not only on compensation, but also prevention. You know, most of the work that we have been discussing is also angled on preventing accidents. But if and unfortunately, sometimes accidents do happen, then there has to be a compensation that is dignified and based on a longer term support. And then lastly, there is an element of return to work, right? So that was also a massive learning from Rana Plaza that a lot and maybe more should have been done in order to assist those who were hurt to actually return to work and to be able to be a productive member of the society. So these three issues, prevention, compensation, and return to work and rehabilitation, they come in hand, and they are part of a modern social protection system. It's the kind of like the elementary step. If nothing else, at least accidents, right? And then of course you have maternity protection, you have health insurance, you have unemployment, and if you're lucky, you may have a pension scheme, right? But that's, you have to start from somewhere.
Yeah, great answer there. Thank you, Tuomo. And it does get you thinking around that modern social protection system and all the aspects that are needed to support those workers. And I am going to go into the Q&A. So you mentioned prevention there, Tuomo, and I will bring this to everybody on the panel. We had a couple of questions that are similar around, I suppose, why we're waiting for incidents to take action. One of the questions, another one sort of on the same line, like Grenfell and fire safety, policy change in the garment industry only seemed to gain impetus when a disaster brought the spotlight firmly onto the issue. So we've had a couple of those listening in talking around that. So one of the questions is, what more can we do to influence policy change and development before the disaster strikes? I'll just open this up, and if anybody wants to answer that one.
Can I take a shot at this?
Oh, thank you, Peter.
Yeah, well, we see this across. It's not just Bangladesh, and it's not just garments. You know, there are areas we've been working on in tea, for example, and sexual harassment, and it's very slow going. And then there's media interest, and all of a sudden everybody's interested. I don't know. I mean, I find it intensely frustrating. It's partly human nature. You know, that focuses people's attention. I think partly everybody's very busy. You know, the senior execs that I talk to are very busy, and it doesn't get onto their desks sometimes as a risk factor until something happens. And again, I'm not defending that. I'm just saying that that's human nature. I would hope that we get better. I think this is one of the motivations for having human rights due diligence as a regulatory requirement rather than something voluntary, because this should get more senior exec and board level of attention in terms of what are your salient risk analysis, what actions you're taking to mitigate that risk, not waiting for a tragedy. Again, I think it's early days, so I don't think we should applaud yet. But I think that is part of the driver behind making these regulatory requirements, is that voluntarism, even through organizations like ETI, don't always get us far enough, fast enough. So if those regulations are crafted well, and if companies take note of that, then maybe they will start to look at endemic risk and systemic risk and mitigate it before we see disasters. But it has been a cycle, not just for this industry, that individually people know things are going on, but it does seem to take an event before people then focus.
Oh, thank you, Peter. Is there anything from Miriam or Tuomo on this one, or I'll jump to another question quickly?
Well, I can just add to it a bit that we hear or see here a huge potential for educating youth and younger generation of managers, as there's a generational shifts going on, right? So young entrepreneurs and young people who are the workers of tomorrow, they need to be educated on prevention and occupational safety and health from the very start, right? And so we do a lot of work on vocational training and skilling. So to integrate that preventive culture and understanding that safety and health is everybody's matter. It's not somebody else who's working, it's yourself. You are working, it's your working environment. So that kind of realization that we all have a role to play and integrating that into our other initiatives and programs from as early as possible, I think that's the game changer in a way.
Fantastic, thank you. Miriam, I can see you've come off mute.
Yeah, just because there's a couple of questions written in the Q&A. So Richard is asking about how the Accord monitors such a large number of factories. We do it through a large team. So, approaching 100 engineers on staff who routinely monitor through sort of half-day inspections to follow up on the initial one-day inspections. And their visits to factories, the frequency varies depending on the types of the kind of the risk level, basically. So if there's quite urgent remediation needed, then the engineers go more frequently to check the progress on that. So that's how we deal with scale, is by investing quite a lot of resource in people. And then the other question there around complaints mechanism. So most factories don't have an effective complaints mechanism system in place. And what's the way forward to deal with the issues in that case? And I think that really points to the discussion we've just been having around how workers are involved and how their interests are represented. So the Accord hosts a complaints mechanism, and we have many trained complaints handlers who receive calls, usually on a mobile phone, and then go and meet the complainants and investigate the issues, sometimes with unannounced inspections or visits to the factories to investigate. So that's an external independent complaints mechanism. But what we really want to see is that issues can be resolved between workers and their representatives and factory managers. And that takes much longer term capacity building, really, and an enabling environment. So I know that's something which ILO, ETI, and in some ways the Accord are all very invested in, trying to kind of create that enabling environment and support resolution of issues at the workplace, ideally. But that takes that is going to take time. That is a culture shift, and that does need to be very much supported in order for workers to raise issues and not fear that they will lose their jobs or be harshly treated as a result. But certainly the Accord's complaints mechanism is currently quite heavily used by workers because they do feel secure. And there have been reprisals, and those have then been reported and then investigated and then dealt with. So it's there has to be quite a lot of investment in running a process like that effectively and to ensure it's secure for workers to use. But thanks for that question.
Lovely, and thank you for picking those up, Miriam. I can see I've got one left and I've got a bit of a summary to do. So I'll just pose it ever so quickly. And I think it did mention heat on your list of those complaint areas, that other 88%. Miriam, but I'll pose to everybody on the panel for a quick one here. With climate risks becoming more prevalent, sort of Bangladesh, Pakistan and other regions, and there are improvements in indoor heat exposure on the agenda of policymakers, brands and supply chains. So is this something that's being considered and action? Do any of you know and can answer this one?
Could I maybe just take a slightly different approach, because I'm not the best at the factual level, but it's a really good question, Ivan, because climate change is going to have an impact in a whole range of ways, both in terms of in-factory conditions, but also in terms of sourcing conditions and raw materials and what have you. And Tuomo can talk to this better than I can, but there's a sort of a just transitions framework about, as companies start to adjust driven by climate change, are they also looking at the human rights impacts, the impacts on people? So whether that is a hotter factory or water sources or resourcing, how that adaptation to climate impacts is going to affect people. And again, that should be built in my opinion, into the human rights due diligence assessment, into any climate change projects and adjustments that you might be having, and including, and you say, you know, hotter factories. How do we keep them cool? How do we make sure the workplace is comfortable and safe?
Lovely, thank you, Peter. I'll bring us to a close with some reflections of the session. I mean, it's all been so fantastic. I've been scribbling away as all the useful information that our expert panel has provided us. But obviously human rights, preventing human rights abuses, that transition to more general occupational safety and health into the accord, the need to make sure we look at labour rights, worker rights, occupational safety and health, obviously being a fundamental principle and right at work and taking action. We need to look at this through brands, global supply chains. I mean, Tuomo mentioned the governance side, the worker side, the private sector. There are all these collaborations and interactions that need to come in play. We also need reliable information and data. And Miriam, I sort of think picked up from a bit of your slides and the conversation we've had on those return to works as well, that compensation, that we need to better address occupational health and safety needs. And Tuomo, you mentioned this quite a few times around that capacity building. So I've written down, we do need to see good occupational safety and health capacity building, good occupational health capacity building, good competency, good awareness, that prevention culture coming through from sort of that vocational side as well. And I've made the points, Pete, you know, I'd mentioned worker voice, but actually is it that agency, social dialogue, collective bargaining? So it's everything. We need all of these moving forward. And obviously we want to see the Accord model replicated into other countries, into other major garment producing countries, but also beyond garment industries. We've heard that actually there's a lot that we need to do here. So we do need to be talking and driving forward decent work, ratification of ILO conventions, and also moving on a safe and healthy working environment being a fundamental principle and right at work with the other fundamental principles and rights at work. So lots of food for thought. It's been fantastic to hold and host this session with all of you, bringing in all of the different views from sort of the ILO, the ETI, the Accord, and just sharing that with listeners now and also beyond when we continue to push this communication out. So my thanks to all those on the panel. So Tuomo, Miriam and Peter, and also thanks to everybody that's been listening and put forward their questions. It's been a fantastic session. And I will now bid you all farewell. So thank you and goodbye. And thanks for tuning into this IOSH webinar.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.